In 1989, a female Marine captain disappeared from her quarters without a trace. Known for her exemplary conduct, her colleagues found it hard to believe that she'd gone AWOL. Military authorities suspected she'd fallen victim to foul play. The FBI joined the investigation. They would find the decorated officer or bring her assailant to justice.
Shirley Russell was a determined woman, determined enough to reach the rank of captain in the United States Marine Corps. When this decorated officer turned up missing, her colleagues refused to believe she'd gone AWOL. It was unclear whether Captain Shirley Russell was dead or alive. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. When a crime is committed on a military installation, it falls under federal jurisdiction. Agents would have to rely on their dedication and instinct to solve the mystery of her disappearance.
The Marine Corps base at Quantico, Virginia, is located 35 miles south of Washington, D.C. Since 1917, it has been headquarters to one of the nation's most selective branches of the military. Over 3,000 Marines train, work, and live on the 100-square-mile base. Nearly everything in civilian life is mirrored on base, from department stores to housing. Married officers have the option of living on base in married officers' quarters, which are known as MOQs. For 6 months, MOQ number 394D was the home of Captain Shirley Gibbs Russell and her husband, Robert Russell. By January 1989, Captain Russell decided to end the marriage. For the next month, she would stay with a friend off base until bachelor's housing was available.
I will. Well, tell me what I gotta do.
Shirley packed her civilian clothes, her uniforms, and her Marine-issue firearm. Robert begged her to stay, but Shirley was determined. For her, the move was final. For Robert, the separation meant he had to move off base. As a former Marine, he would be losing his last tie to the Corps. Captain Russell continued to advance in her career as the adjutant to the commanding officer of the support battalion at the Marine Basic School. She was in charge of all personnel matters and administrative needs of the support battalion. She was known as a dedicated Marine by her peers and by her commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel James Hodges.
When I first met Shirley Russell, I was very impressed with the fact that she was a black female captain, because we just don't have that many in the Marine Corps, and that she had come from a poor background and was making something of herself, and she seemed so energized and so eager to keep moving up the rank structure.
Captain Russell?
While assigned together, they built a friendship based on mutual respect.
I can't talk to you right now. Now is not a good time.
Hodges knew that Shirley's marriage was in trouble.
I'll have to talk to you later.
My relationship with Shirley Russell was very special, even though that I was her commanding officer and her ultimate boss, if you will. I was very close to her as sort of a big brother mentor. And we talked sometimes, after working hours about her situation, her marriage, her past, and so forth.
Thank you, sir.
On Thursday, March 2nd, about a month after her split with Robert, Shirley requested leave from work. She needed to clean her former quarters and finalize her legal separation. 4 days later, on Monday, March 6th, Hodges arrived at the office expecting to find Shirley at her desk. He was surprised to find her office empty. Shirley had a perfect work record. She had never been late to report.
And when I walked in the door, I asked Major Buck Bourgeois right away, and I said, "Where's Shirley?" And he said, "Sir, she's not here." And instantly, I felt like, oh no, something has happened to her.
Lieutenant Colonel Hodges investigated the unauthorized absence. Captain Russell had recently moved into bachelor officers' quarters on base. Hodges hoped he would find her at home.
Captain Russell! Captain Russell!
Open the door, Corporal, please, sir.
As the missing captain's commanding officer, Hodges had authorization to search the room.
Captain Russell!
There was no sign of her, and no indication she had moved out.
Lock up, Corporal.
Yes, sir.
The Marines returned to the office and contacted the captain's husband, who now lived off base. Hodges knew that Robert Russell had helped Shirley clean and paint their vacated quarters over the weekend. They arranged to meet at the couple's former MOQ. The Marine officers inspected the residence. Russell told them that he and Shirley had met here around noon on Saturday to do some touch-up painting.
Sorry.
According to Russell, Shirley volunteered to buy some paint from the base exchange at about 1:30. He claimed that she didn't take her car, but walked to the PX instead. Russell said he hadn't seen her since.
She went to get more paint.
Lieutenant Colonel Hodges didn't believe Robert Russell's story.
It hit me as just totally a lie because the PX was probably 4 or 5 miles away. And there's no way in the world that she would have walked to the PX from their quarters.
Outside the quarters, the officers also inspected Russell's storage shed. On the floor, Colonel Hodges noticed a rust-colored stain. Russell dismissed it as paint. Hodges was skeptical. He was no expert, but to him, it looked like blood. Lieutenant Colonel Hodges briefed the Naval Investigative Service. The NIS reported the possibility of a crime to the FBI's Washington field office. The NIS briefed special agents on the case.
4 days.
Captain Russell had been missing for 3 days. With no indication of her whereabouts, the agents followed standard procedure. Special Agent Alan Malinchak headed the case.
When you have somebody missing, you either have a case of an abduction, you have a case of a missing person, somebody who's walked away for whatever reason, or you have foul play. So the initial investigation that the FBI was involved in ran all 3 of those investigative lines.
Mr. Russell?
According to standard procedure, the missing woman's husband, Robert Russell, was the first to be questioned.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
He told agents that he was talking with a neighbor around 1:30 the afternoon of Shirley's disappearance, when a friend of hers stopped by to pick her up for lunch. At 3:30, Robert said he called her bachelor officers' quarters to see if she had gone home. The duty clerk had not seen Captain Russell, so Robert left a message. Around 4 p.m., Robert borrowed his housemate's car and drove to Pennsylvania to spend the weekend with his parents.
You feel it? personally threatened by this, or did your wife?
During the first interview that I had with Robert Russell, he was very calm, very businesslike, wanted to assist the FBI in the investigation, and provided me with multiple locations of where Shirley might be, who she may be associated with, what could have happened.
Midnight phone calls.
Russell thought it was possible someone had abducted or harmed her. Though Shirley had no enemies, the couple had experienced some trouble due to their interracial marriage. Russell told agents he and his wife frequently visited his hometown near Mahanoy City, Pennsylvania. One afternoon, while shopping, the Russells were harassed by racists. According to her husband, Shirley had been frightened, but another incident scared her even more. An unidentified man had called their house on base.
Hello?
The caller used racial epithets and threatened to harm the couple.
How'd you get my number?
Whoever the caller was knew where the Russells lived. After the threatening phone calls, Robert told officials he felt Shirley might need protection for the times he couldn't be with her. At a pawn shop near base, Robert picked out a .25 caliber Raven semi-automatic just 2 days before Shirley disappeared.
Hey, got your pan?
It's about time.
Russell told agents he surprised Shirley with the gift on the day they met to clean their former quarters.
I want you to be safe.
According to Russell, Shirley was appreciative of the pearl-handled weapon.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Agents were suspicious of the story. As a Marine captain, Shirley already had a personal sidearm. If she felt unsafe, why would she need another gun? With Shirley and the gun nowhere to be found, that question would be difficult to answer. Marine Captain Shirley Gibbs Russell had vanished from base housing on March 4th, 1989. Her husband was the last person to have seen her. Agents needed to corroborate his story. The FBI interviewed Marine Captain Patrice Gale. According to Robert Russell, on the day Shirley disappeared, Captain Gale had arrived at Shirley's former residence to pick her up for lunch at about 1:30. Gale confirmed this. Robert also told her that Shirley had gone for paint and hadn't returned.
But we ran out of paint.
Captain Gale thought this was odd.
Okay, that's probably a good idea.
Shirley never missed appointments. And this one had been especially important. Just a day earlier, Gale had accompanied Shirley to the base legal office to pick up her separation papers. Shirley planned to present them to Robert the day they painted their former quarters. This would make their separation official, and Shirley worried about Robert's reaction. Afterwards, she would need a friend to talk to and ask Captain Gale to meet her. When Shirley failed to show up, Captain Gale worried that Robert had done something to her friend.
She see what piece
FBI agents checked Shirley's bachelor officer's quarters. The clerk had not seen her since Saturday, March 4th, the day she disappeared. On that same Saturday, Corporal Dan Caraway confirmed that Robert Russell had called, looking for his wife. The corporal noted the time in his logbook as 3:30 p.m. About a half hour after he took the message, Caraway thought he saw Captain Russell. She was talking on the telephone. He recalled that she was wearing jeans and a maroon sweater. He wanted to give her the message that her husband had called, but he was distracted. By the time Caraway was free, the woman he thought was Captain Shirley Russell was gone. His description contradicted Robert Russell's statement that Shirley had been wearing a blue jogging outfit. The corporal also only saw the woman from behind. He never got a good look at her face.
Thank you very much. If anything else, I'll get in touch with you, okay? Have a good day, sir. You do the same now.
Agents doubted if she ever returned to her apartment. They found no trace that Shirley had changed her clothes or brought back the separation papers. Investigators questioned Russell's old neighbors. One of them said she saw a blue station wagon backed up to the Russell shed on the day Shirley had disappeared. She noted the time was 5 p.m. This was an hour later than Russell claimed he left for Pennsylvania. Investigators wondered if Robert Russell was mistaken or lying. Agent Alan Malinchek called the FBI in Pennsylvania to pin down Russell's whereabouts the rest of that day. Special Agent Michael Quirk of the Allentown office became co-case agent. He contacted Robert's parents.
Robert Russell had traveled to St. Clair, Pennsylvania on March 4th, 1989, and he stayed with his family the weekend of March 4th, March 5th.
FBI interviews with Russell's family confirmed he had arrived alone. None of them had seen Shirley. The FBI launched a media campaign seeking the public's help. Captain Shirley Gibbs Russell's photo was featured in television and newspaper stories. Leads began to pour in. Midway between Quantico and Robert Russell's hometown, a clerk in York, Pennsylvania, called federal authorities. The clerk reported that a young black woman had been in the store on the afternoon of Saturday, March 4th, the day Captain Shirley Gibbs Russell disappeared from Quantico. According to the clerk, the woman bought several items and paid with a check. The clerk asked the woman for identification. She produced a military ID card. She resembled photos the clerk had seen in the newspaper.
Do you mind if I look at your bank receipts?
The agent asked to see the checks received on that
Do you
day.
mind if I've seen the receipts? Sure. Okay.
He found that none of them were written by Shirley Gibbs Russell. Assistant U.S. Attorney Lawrence Leiser worked with the FBI on the case. He noted another detail that suggested the woman in the store was not Captain Russell.
The color of the ID and the location of the picture in the ID described as belonging to Shirley Russell was the ID of a dependent military person, not of an active duty military person.
There had been no activity since March 4th in Captain Russell's bank or credit card accounts, nor had she called her family or friends. Considering Shirley's stable character, her disappearance didn't make sense to Agent Alan Malinchek.
She was the type of person who was going to do very well in the Marine Corps. She would be promoted. She had that capability. She was sharp. She was squared away. She easy to make friends. Everybody that worked with her liked her. She had a lot of stability in her life with regard to church and family. For her to just disappear of her own accord just didn't make any logical sense.
With no word from her or a kidnapper, agents believed it was likely that Captain Shirley Gibbs Russell was dead. They were now searching for her body. Dozens of Marines fanned out across the huge base. They searched hundreds of acres of dense woods the Marines used for training. They found no trace of the missing captain. Perhaps Robert Russell knew more about his wife's disappearance than he was telling the FBI.
Quantico Marine Base.
Agents asked him to submit to a polygraph examination.
Lieutenant Colonel Hodges, this is Dave.
He agreed.
Saying that the last time you saw her, you were painting your quarters, and it was sometime prior to 3 p.m. on Saturday, March 4th?
That's correct.
As before, agents found him to be cool and cooperative. For almost 3 hours, Robert Russell answered dozens of questions relating to Shirley's whereabouts.
Mr. Russell, could you advise me where you...
He was subjected to 3 separate exams.
Was this red spot paint, Mr. Russell?
Yes, it was.
Each time, Robert Russell was found to be deceptive. When agents told him the results, Russell seemed unfazed, almost smug.
Just to exclude you from any evidence we found.
He even consented to be fingerprinted. Perhaps he was aware that polygraphs were inadmissible in a federal court of law. Without a body, agents would need something stronger than a hunch to prove that Russell had killed his wife and disposed of her. In the spring of 1989, the FBI continued to hunt for the body of Marine Captain Shirley Gibbs Russell. In their search for answers, agents delved deeper into the background of their prime suspect, her husband, Robert Russell. Special Agent Michael Quirk learned that Russell was already married before he met Shirley. He had 2 children with his first wife, Pam. The marriage only lasted 6 years. In 1986, Russell told his wife that he wanted a divorce. He left Pam and their children on Christmas Day. 6 months later, Robert married Shirley while they were both stationed at Parris Island, South Carolina. The FBI learned that Shirley was transferred to Quantico a short time later. They also learned that Robert told friends that the distance was hurting his marriage. He claimed he was leaving the Marine Corps to join Shirley in Quantico in order to stabilize their relationship. But agents discovered a different motive for the move. Agents believed it was unlikely Robert would voluntarily relinquish his rank as captain. Being in the Marine Corps was Robert's whole life and whole world. Military records showed that in February of 1988, while stationed at Gulfport, Mississippi, Robert's superiors found that his passion for the Corps did not seem to apply to its regulations. They issued Robert a less than honorable discharge for dereliction of duty and defrauding the government. He was escorted out of his office and was prohibited from taking anything with him except his own clothing. Although Robert was no longer a Marine, he moved into officers' quarters at Quantico based on Shirley's rank of captain. While Shirley supported him, Robert tried to get his life back on track by becoming a teacher at a nearby high school. But his drinking started to become excessive. He was getting drunk more often and staying out later.
Robert?
Shirley was distraught. She joined Al-Anon, a support group for the loved ones of alcoholics. When Robert became physically abusive, Shirley finally left him.
Don't touch me.
Assistant U.S. Attorney Lawrence Leiser believed that Robert's problems left Shirley few alternatives.
She realized the marriage was going nowhere, began to get counseling from a local counseling center that was made available to members of the Marine Corps. She also consulted with a Navy lawyer to begin the divorce process.
To investigators, Russell's instability and abusive behavior reinforced their belief that he was capable of killing Shirley.
His personality could not tolerate the fact that this black woman, his wife, was a Marine Corps captain who was successful, who was succeeding in her career, and to top it all off, wanted to divorce him.
Agents learned that during her separation, Shirley had sought refuge off base with her close friend, fellow Marine Captain Ann Mack. Captain Mack told Agent Malinchek that Shirley was afraid of her husband. She intended to leave him, but needed a place to stay.
She had asked Captain Ann Mack if she could stay with her at her townhome in the Springfield, Virginia area, and Captain Ann Mack agreed and laid out some ground rules about Bob Russell not being there, not coming into the house, nothing like that whatsoever.
But it was not enough to keep Robert away from Shirley. Mack was worried about her. Mack told investigators that Robert was stalking Shirley. On several occasions, he showed up at the house early in the morning as Shirley was leaving. He harassed his wife until she agreed to spend some time with him. Mack said that Robert Russell was living off base. He had moved in with one of his new colleagues. An FBI agent checked the address. It was the home of Sandy Flint. Sandy Flint offered little. She said she knew nothing about Robert's missing wife. On the way out, the agent met Robert Flint, Sandy's father-in-law. He was a retired painter who had worked at the base at Quantico for 10 years. Mr. Flint told the agent about a conversation he had with Robert Russell 2 days after Shirley's disappearance.
Robert Russell asked him how to clean up stains from concrete floors. And the father-in-law had told Bob Russell that you could just use chlorine or soap and water and that would pretty much clean it up or dilute it. And Bob had asked him, well, what if it's blood? And the father-in-law had said, well, you could use muriatic acid.
Mr. Flint told the agent something else of interest. Sandy and her husband had recently separated. He suspected Sandy was now having an affair with Robert Russell. With each new person agents interviewed, they found more deception from Robert Russell. If Sandy was indeed involved with Russell, she might know if he had killed Shirley. Agents would inform her it would be unwise to obstruct a federal murder case. Sandy agreed to speak with the FBI. This time, agents found her to be far more cooperative. She described her role in Robert Russell's obsession.
She had admitted to having an intimate affair with Bob Russell while Bob Russell was still married. She advised us that she, at Bob's request, she had surveilled Shirley Russell. She could report to Bob Shirley's activities and whereabouts.
He enlisted her as his spy. Sandy told the FBI Russell was convinced that Shirley was having an affair. He wanted to know where Shirley went and who she met. Sandy followed her everywhere, but found nothing to support his delusional fixation.
And he was so compulsive, he wanted to catch his wife cheating. Of course, the irony of all of this is she wasn't cheating at all. It was he who was cheating on her.
Robert was too far gone for logic. He refused to believe the assurances of his mistress. In his own mind, if he was cheating, so was Shirley. And he would go to any length to prove it. He told Sandy that he broke into his wife's car and planted a voice-activated recorder. When it failed to record anything incriminating, he decided he needed to get closer. Robert broke into Ann Mack's house to bug Shirley's bedroom. What happened next told Sandy that her lover's obsession had completely consumed him. Robert called his mistress from his wife's bedroom, speaking in a whisper.
You won't believe where I'm at.
He told Sandy he was drinking Shirley's wine and reading her journal.
Sitting on the bed. Wow.
Then he said something she would never forget.
He had informed her that if Shirley comes missing, it'll be me. I'll have taken care of her. And she had said, "We can't do that. They're going to look for her." He says, "And if anybody questions you on this, deny it. Don't even admit to the conversation we're having now."
Sandy's statements were incriminating, but it was her word against his. To corroborate her story, the FBI needed physical evidence.
We requested a consent search of Captain Ann Mack's residence and retrieved several items, and some of those items, one was a telephone and one was a wine glass. And when we sent those to the FBI laboratory for analysis, we were able to develop Robert Russell's fingerprints on those items.
The FBI now had its first piece of physical evidence to corroborate that Robert Russell obsessively stalked his wife. But without Shirley's body, it was still not enough to charge him with murder. In March of 1989, there was little evidence to link Robert Russell to the murder of his wife, Marine Captain Shirley Gibbs Russell. Early in the investigation, agents learned the suspect had been having an affair with Sandy Flint. Flint now told the FBI more about the day Shirley Gibbs Russell disappeared. She said Robert Russell had borrowed her car, a blue station wagon, to drive to his parents' house in Pennsylvania. She remembered he left her house sometime after 4 p.m. Sandy thought this was strange because he could have used his own pickup truck. Assistant U.S. Attorney Lawrence Leiser believed Russell borrowed her car that day to transport Shirley's body to Pennsylvania.
The reason he asked to use that car was because he had an open bed pickup truck. The body was still in the storage shed, and he had to dispose of the body. And he couldn't do it in an open bed pickup truck, so he borrowed the closed station wagon of his girlfriend to dispose of the body.
Agents hoped to substantiate this theory. They returned to Russell's former residence, where his neighbor had seen the same blue station wagon backed up to his shed. Investigators needed to take a closer look at the floor, where Lieutenant Colonel Hodges had seen the rust-colored stain. But the stain was gone, at least on the surface.
And as they were chiseling the whitewashed pieces of the concrete up, Bob Russell had asked them what's going on, and they had told him that they're taking these samples to determine what the substance is on the concrete. And Mr. Russell had voluntarily told them, well, I had cleaned that up with some muriatic acid.
The FBI lab confirmed that muriatic acid was present on the concrete. The same substance that Mr. Flint had suggested Russell use to remove blood from cement. Technicians found no trace of blood or paint on the chips. What could have been a key piece of forensic evidence had been destroyed. Agents hoped Sandy Flint's car would reveal more. FBI examiners scoured the station wagon inside and out. It was unusually clean for an older car that had so recently made a round trip from Virginia to Pennsylvania. It turned out to be another dead end. As the investigation stalled in Virginia, Robert Russell split up with Sandy, packed his things, and moved to Pennsylvania to start a new life. The FBI's investigative focus turned north as well. Agents followed Robert's every move. They observed that while he relied on his parents for support, he was very close to his brothers Mike and Ron. Agents approached the brothers on several occasions. Mike Russell agreed to meet with agents. He told them that the day after Robert arrived in Pennsylvania following Shirley's disappearance, Robert took Sandy Flint's station wagon to a nearby car wash. Robert and his brother thoroughly cleaned the inside of the car, vacuuming it and spraying it with deodorizer. Agents believed Robert's actions demonstrated his intent to remove any evidence that Shirley's body had been in the car. Mike Russell told agents he never saw a body. He did concede that his brother's behavior had seemed desperate since Shirley left him. 2 months before she disappeared, Mike and his older brother Ron drove to Virginia to take away Robert's guns. Agent Quirk recalled that his brothers felt this was necessary to prevent Robert from hurting someone.
He was depressed in the fact that he was no longer in the Marine Corps, that he loved the Marine Corps. He didn't have money. He was a captain in the Marine Corps. Now he's a special education teacher. Shirley had removed him from her checking account, so he was having problems financially.
Circumstantial evidence was mounting, but the FBI lacked one crucial piece of evidence for their case: Shirley Gibbs Russell's body. The first question was where to look. Agents learned the answer from Robert Russell's first wife, Pam. Robert's boyhood home was in Schuylkill County, a rural, mountainous region in northeastern Pennsylvania. Thousands of coal mines, mostly abandoned, are scattered throughout the rugged county. Some are hundreds of feet deep and partially filled with water. As a young man, suspect Robert Russell had spent much of his time hiking and hunting in the region. His family said he knew the place like the back of his hand. A search conducted in this terrain would be daunting, but nobody ever questioned whether it should be done. 150 people participated in the extensive ground search for Shirley Gibbs Russell in early May. Volunteers from the FBI, the Marines, the Naval Investigative Service, and the Pennsylvania State Police participated. None of them were more eager to find the missing Marine than her own peers from the United States Marine Corps. 9 helicopters and 6 transport trucks filled with Marines were deployed. Over 3 days, they searched 2,000 acres of land. They never found Captain Russell's body. Agents would soon develop a theory as to why the search was not more fruitful. Agent Quirk learned about a strange phone call Ron Russell received from his brother Robert.
Robert had asked Ron if he could get him some dynamite. And Robert had stated that he couldn't get dynamite at Quantico because it was too expensive. And Ron had asked Robert, why do you want dynamite? And Robert's response was, I want to blow up Shirley.
Ron never bought it, but agents now wondered whether Robert Russell had thrown Shirley's body into a mine shaft, then sealed her grave with an explosion. The search did yield one surprising result. an agent found what appeared to be the grip of a gun handle. It was sent to the Firearms and Tool Marks Unit at the FBI's lab in Washington, D.C. for analysis. By comparing the samples to hundreds of other guns, examiners determined that it was consistent with the grip of a .25 caliber Raven semi-automatic. It was the same type of gun Robert Russell had purchased from a pawn shop on March 2nd, 2 days before his wife disappeared. Unfortunately, the tantalizing discovery would not help with the prosecution. Agents never found Robert's fingerprints on the gun part. To prosecutors, it looked as if the ex-Marine had covered his tracks well. Without a murder weapon or a body, it would be next to impossible to convict Robert Russell of murder.
Very clear.
After an investigation spanning 2 months, 2 states, and thousands of man-hours, the FBI was no closer to arresting their prime suspect, Robert Russell, for the murder of his wife, Marine Captain Shirley Gibbs Russell. Though agents had gathered a significant amount of circumstantial evidence, Assistant U.S. Attorney Lawrence Leiser didn't have enough physical evidence to prosecute Russell for the crime.
We didn't have a body, we didn't have eyewitnesses, we didn't have weapon, and it just took a tremendous amount of investigative skill and effort to put the pieces together, to go out and search out the leads, tremendous amount of hours and energy that these FBI agents took to gather the evidence.
Authorities didn't even have enough evidence to make an arrest. Agents were frustrated, as were the hundreds of Marines whose lives had been touched by Captain Shirley Russell.
It was like the loss of a child or a dear friend, and there was nothing you could do about it. And what frustrated me so much was she was so close to being extricated from her bad marriage. And for her to be killed, it still bothers me to this day. I mean, it's just one of those things that you just never really totally get over.
It looked as if Robert Russell was going to get away with murder. But Russell's past indiscretions would come back to haunt him.
We had been contacted by the Naval Investigative Service at Gulfport, Mississippi, that there was some evidence in a locker there that they had maintained from when Bob was discharged from the Marine Corps. And so they sent it to us, and it turned out to be a floppy disk.
It had been confiscated when Russell was relieved of duty in Mississippi, a year before Shirley Russell disappeared. For security reasons, no service member who has been relieved of duty is allowed to go through their documents after dismissal. One of Russell's former superiors found the disk and read its menu of contents.
One of those items that he saw on the menu was the word murder. And he pushed the mouse for that, on that word murder, and up came 26 steps, very detailed and elaborate steps on how Robert Peter Russell was planning the murder of Captain Shirley Gibbs.
Russell's plan clearly documented his intentions.
The 26 steps was a very revealing piece of evidence because it showed the man's state of mind, his willingness to even contemplate murdering another human being, let alone his wife. Step 1 is leave Thursday, January 18th for Paris Island. Well, who was at Paris Island? Shirley Russell. Make it look as if she left. Well, that's exactly what he tried to do when he did murder his wife. And then the last thing he says is blame it on her own kind, obviously referring to her race. This is a man who clearly had the mental wherewithal and intent and motivation to do this kind of act.
On February 8th, 1991, The computer file convinced federal prosecutors to bring charges against Robert Peter Russell for the murder of his wife, Captain Shirley Gibbs Russell. Ironically, Russell was arrested in a prison.
Need you to step with us?
He had recently taken a job as a substance abuse counselor at Pennsylvania's Graterford State Correctional Institution.
York, got exactly.
But prosecution would not be easy.
Right here.
Let's go make some notes.
Assistant U.S. Attorney Lawrence Leiser would have to assemble all the pieces of circumstantial evidence like a mosaic. Hopefully, the jury would see the portrait of a killer emerge.
Let's see what we got here.
Assistant U.S. Attorney and co-prosecutor Michael Rich would help to prepare the case against Russell.
It was clear that we were going to have to make it on, circumstantial evidence. A lot of that circumstantial evidence was as a result of what Bobby Russell had been saying and doing since his wife's disappearance in 1989. So the plan was to assemble all that into some sort of coherent scheme and present that.
Never before had the federal government attempted to try someone for first-degree murder based solely on circumstantial evidence. At trial, the prosecution asserted that Robert Russell intended to commit murder when he bought the .25 caliber Raven semi-automatic on March 2nd.
Sweet, how much?
Several of his co-workers reported that he had told them a .25 caliber is a perfect weapon. It leaves little evidence behind. He said there is virtually no blood spatter, and the bullet usually lodges in the body. On Saturday, March 4th, when Shirley gave him the separation papers, he refused to sign. Just after noon that day, the prosecution believed Robert Russell snuck up on Shirley in the shed. He had to wait for nightfall before he could remove the body. To establish an alibi, he talked with a neighbor and lied to Shirley's friend about his wife walking to the base exchange to buy paint.
Okay, that's probably a good idea. See.
Around 4 p.m., he went to Sandy Flint's house and borrowed her station wagon. After night fell, he wrapped Shirley's body in a tarp and placed it in the back of the car. Their neighbors saw it backed up to the shed. He then drove 4 hours to St. Clair, Pennsylvania with the body in the back of the car. Once there, he knew exactly where to go. There were hundreds of abandoned mines to choose from. Then, Robert Russell, who had once sworn to uphold honor as a member of the Marine Corps, dumped his wife's body into a mine shaft. He threw dynamite in to bury the evidence under thousands of pounds of rock. The jurors were convinced. On May 3rd, 1991, Robert Peter Russell was convicted of murdering his wife, Shirley Gibbs Russell. Robert Russell was sentenced to life. There is no parole in the federal system. He will never leave prison alive. In 1992, a young mother was gunned down in front of her children. Police searched for answers but found nothing. Then family members offered a startling clue. It would take local and federal agents to untangle an intricate web of money, drugs, and murder, to capture the architects of a heartbreaking crime.
Two young boys were the only witnesses to their mother's murder. The horrible crime appeared unmotivated, senseless, and random. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. The victim, the wife of a prominent Atlanta attorney, was also a woman burdened with a secret. The FBI believed that secret led to her death. They hoped its discovery would also lead to her killer.
November 29th, 1992, Atlanta, Georgia. Travelers returned home at the end of the Thanksgiving holiday.
It's been a long trip, but I'm ready to get home. What about you?
39-year-old Sarah Tokars and her two children had spent the long weekend with her parents in Florida. Her husband, a well-known lawyer and judge, was away on business. After a 9-hour drive, they arrived safely in their suburban Atlanta neighborhood of Marietta. The house was dark as they pulled into the driveway. But it was not empty. Sarah did not see a man waiting in the shadows of the garage. He brandished a weapon. The gunman forced Sarah back into the SUV. The terrified woman had a 6-year-old at her side and a 4-year-old still asleep in the car. She had no choice. The man put his gun to Sarah's head and told her to drive towards the city.
Make this left now, this left.
She followed instructions. As they reached an empty development, he told her to turn off. She refused. She pleaded with him to let her children go. He answered with a single gunshot to her head. As the gunman grabbed her purse and fled, the vehicle kept rolling. The children still inside. When it came to a stop, Sarah's 6-year-old son had to reach across his mother's body to turn off the ignition. He unbuckled his groggy 4-year-old brother from his car seat, then ran to the nearest house. There, a neighbor called 911. Officers responded to the report of a possible homicide in the vicinity of Powers Road. Cobb County Police were dispatched immediately. Homicide detectives arrived as officers fanned out to search for the gunman. Police briefed them on the spot.
What do we have going on?
The two young boys who witnessed the shooting identified the victim as their mother, Sarah Tokars. Their father, Fred Tokars, was out of town. Police were already trying to contact him. Forensic technicians examined the vehicle where it had stopped. There might be trace evidence outside as well as inside the car. An analysis confirmed what the boys had told police. The gunman was sitting directly behind Sarah Tokars when he pulled the trigger. Blood spatter patterns suggested he had used a shotgun. Detectives knew it would be difficult to get detailed information from children so young, especially after such a traumatic experience. The oldest one, 6 years old, would try his best. He said the killer was a black male, wearing jeans, a sweatshirt, and a cap. He could not be more specific. The boy didn't know which way the killer had run after he grabbed his mother's purse. But he said the weapon looked like a pirate's gun that you would see on TV.
And we'll get in touch with them.
Detectives were not sure what he meant. Maybe the autopsy would tell them more. Detectives tracked down relatives living in the area to take custody of the boys until their father could be located. Police learned the family's address by running the plates on the vehicle. They continued the investigation at the Tokars' home where the abduction had occurred. In the living room, they found a security dowel lying next to a sliding glass door. The killer had likely entered the house here. The home security system had not been activated.
Right here, let's get some photographs.
No alarm sounded as the intruder entered.
And then after that, I want you to go ahead and process it.
Perhaps a burglar had taken advantage of the lax security, and Sarah surprised him when she returned home. Whoever the burglar was, he hadn't left any trace evidence at the Tokars' home. There was little to go on, according to Cobb County Chief Detective Arthur Allred.
At this point, we just really didn't know what happened. This was in a upper middle class neighborhood. This was a mother with her 2 children, and this type of crime was just didn't occur in this area at all. The most serious crime we had probably vandalism. So initially, we were really baffled as to what had happened and why.
Sarah's eldest son worked with a police sketch artist and described the man in the dark who had killed his mother. The drawing of a thin black man wearing a knit hat was released to the public. But the 6-year-old's description was too vague to elicit any viable leads. The victim's husband, Fred Tokars, was contacted at his hotel in Montgomery, Alabama. He returned to Atlanta immediately. As a criminal defense attorney, Tokars was aware he would be considered an early suspect in his wife's murder. He had his own attorney present when he spoke to authorities. They quickly established his alibi so police could pursue more promising leads. Detectives confirmed that at the time of the murder, Fred Tokars was in Alabama. He had been visiting a client incarcerated in the Montgomery jail. The grieving husband assured police that he and Sarah had a strong marriage.
I don't answer any questions. I just want to basically, see the case.
He would do anything he could to help find her killer.
Due to the nature of what's going on, we have a job to do.
All right, guys.
Tokars agreed to walk detectives through the house.
Anything's been messed up here.
As far as he knew, the doors were locked and the security rod was in place when he left for Montgomery. He explained that they had intentionally left the alarm off because a plumber was scheduled to fix the hot water heater over the weekend. Tokars led detectives to the basement where he kept his home office. He said he usually had about $1,500 locked in the safe. Now it was open and empty.
I do keep some cash in there.
Its combination was hidden in a nearby file. Only he and his wife knew it was there. Perhaps Sarah had taken the money on her trip to Florida. It was also possible that the burglar had found the combination and taken the cash.
Looks like everything's okay.
Ultimately, Tokars couldn't specify how much money, if any, was missing.
All right.
To police, nothing else in the house seemed disturbed, and no clues pointed to the killer's identity.
A lot of people were frightened. A lot of people just couldn't believe that this would happen to a mother in front of her children, and especially in the neighborhood where it occurred. So there was a lot of pressure on the department to find who had killed her.
Police hoped the coroner's report would give them more. Lab examiners confirmed that Sarah Tokars had been killed with a .410 shotgun. To a child, if that type of weapon had been sawed off, it might look like a 17th century flintlock pistol used by pirates on TV. Only the plastic wadding and buckshot were recovered from the SUV.
It might be a 410 or maybe a 20 gauge.
Because no shell casing had been ejected, they would not be able to match anything to a specific weapon if one were later found.
Maybe 410. I'll get to the ballistics for you.
The examiner discovered no foreign hairs, fibers, or fingerprints on the body or clothing.
That fell out of the body bag.
The anonymous killer had left nothing that could lead investigators to his
Very
identity.
interesting to show you.
Former Assistant United States Attorney Buddy Parker, like many members of the Atlanta community, was stunned by the news of the murder.
We had a discussion that morning about the notoriety of the homicide, of it being the wife of Fred Tokars, who was known within the legal community, having been a former assistant district attorney for Fulton County. I was familiar with Fred Tokars in his role as a criminal defense lawyer in a matter that was then pending in our office, a matter regarding the investigation of a particular drug dealer.
Fred Tokars' lucrative criminal defense practice brought him into contact with many men accused of federal drug charges. Rarely does such a murder have a simple motive. Solving the case would not be easy. The following day, 2 women came to the Cobb County Police Station. Sarah Tokars' sister and her cousin had a file they needed to show detectives. Sarah had entrusted her sister with the file 3 years earlier.
You know what this is? This is some of her husband friends.
At the time, Sarah made her promise to take it to police if anything ever happened to her.
Something would happen, divorce, overseas bank.
It contained what appeared to be lists of Fred Tokars' bank accounts and their balances.
I told her 3 years ago.
Well, how long have you known?
The women suggested that the papers might be related to Sarah's attempt to divorce Fred.
His family, my family have been friends. I can't put up with it anymore.
Her sister's marriage was not as strong as Fred had led police to believe.
Well, that might be so, but I know what you've been doing.
Sarah wanted a divorce, but whenever she broached the subject, he threatened to use his legal connections to get sole custody of their children.
All right, guys. Let me tell you something.
Sarah was trapped.
Divorce, but you'll never see the
If she ever hoped to divorce Fred and keep her children, she needed leverage.
Well, in case there was a divorce.
After the incident, Sarah had secretly copied some of Fred's files and gave them to her sister for safekeeping.
Quite a long time.
She suspected they outlined illegal activities he might be involved in.
Liar. Wouldn't treat my sister.
If that were so, they could be her only leverage against him in court.
She went to his office.
Some of the information you
Investigators reviewed the files carefully. Perhaps they would help police determine whether Sarah Tokars' death was a botched robbery or a carefully planned conspiracy. Cobb County detectives called the FBI office in Atlanta for help. They hoped that Special Agent Michael Twible could determine if Fred Tokar's bank statements were somehow linked to the murder.
We were contacted by the Cobb County authorities concerning the documents they had discovered, which were brought to them by Sarah Tokar's sister and cousin, which revealed that Mr. Tokar's, her husband, had been involved in setting up offshore bank accounts and offshore corporations.
It would take time for Agent Twible and his team to unravel the names and finances on those documents to see if they had something or nothing to do with the death of Sarah Tokar's. On December 3rd, 1997, 4 days after the shooting, Sarah Tokar's was laid to rest. Her 2 children were left motherless. Investigators still had no leads that pointed to the identity of her killer. Whoever had killed the young mother was still out on the streets. Just after Thanksgiving in 1997, the FBI and local investigators continued their search for the lone gunman who shot and killed Sarah Tokar's, the wife of a prominent Atlanta attorney, in front of her 2 young children. Sarah's 6-year-old child had given a vague description of the suspect to police in Cobb County, Georgia, but they still had no solid leads. Copies of her husband's bank statements were sent to the FBI field office in Atlanta for closer scrutiny. Special Agent Michael Twible hoped to provide insight as to whether the documents might somehow be connected to Sarah Tokar's murder.
Once we reviewed these documents, it revealed that Mr. Tokar's had set up offshore banks and corporations not only in the Turk and Caicos, but in Montserrat and in the Bahamas. These documents also showed that he had set up numerous corporations and nominees' names in the Atlanta, Georgia area.
Nominees are people who in name only head dummy corporations for purposes of money laundering. Although Fred Tokar's had never been accused of money laundering himself, he was an expert on the subject. Buddy Parker, a former assistant U.S. attorney, was aware that Tokar's was not only a well-known lawyer, he was also a certified public accountant.
Fred Tokar's was known within the Atlanta legal community as a person who held himself out to be an expert in money laundering, and in fact conducted lectures for law enforcement authorities at the state level on money laundering.
Investigating the finances of a man like Fred Tokar's would be a delicate business. He was well liked and well connected among Atlanta's power elite.
He was well known in Cobb County. He was also well known in political circles, in as much as he had been appointed as an assistant municipal court judge, and he had been an assistant solicitor for Fulton County. He had a lot of friends in high political places and helped on numerous campaigns of state and local officials.
I'm wondering if you have any...
Investigators again met with Tokar's and his attorney. They told him they believed his business dealings could be connected to his wife's killing and asked him about his clients.
Has your wife mentioned anything to you about anyone that she...
Fred Tokar's admitted several were violent drug dealers who operated in dangerous circles. One in particular was reputed to have been a major cocaine supplier in the Atlanta area. The dealer had returned home to Detroit after another one of Tokar's clients had allegedly forced him out of the South. Not long after, he was gunned down in front of his mother's home. The murder weapon, a handgun found later in a nearby alley, had been traced back to a gun shop north of Atlanta. Tokars suggested that the dealer's remaining crew, or even those who murdered him, could have had Sarah killed to send a message to the lawyer.
We can arrange something and get it over to you.
Detectives secured a warrant to search the attorney's office to see if they could find any link to the killer in his papers. That night, local investigators and IRS agents conducted a thorough search of the office. They confiscated files, date books, and business calendars dating back several years, but found no direct clues to the murder. In the margins of Tokar's date books, agents did find notations of offshore accounts. The total deposited in these accounts far exceeded the amount Tokars claimed on his taxes each year. It looked as if Fred Tokars had used his expertise in money laundering to his own financial advantage. Local and federal officials met with representatives of the Atlanta United States Attorney's Office. They suspected Fred Tokar's illegal activities went far beyond money laundering.
Money laundering was already on our radar screen, if you will. Secondly, now we have evidence coming out of the Tokars' home of offshore bank accounts. With those two clear facts, we felt that there was a firm basis to open an investigation formally on Fred Tokars.
Parker learned that in August of 1992, the DEA had arrested one of Tokar's clients in a sting operation. His name was Anthony Brown. Brown had a reputation as a cocaine dealer in Atlanta. The day before, agents had intercepted one of his couriers in Texas and seized more than 100 kilos of cocaine. Inside the trunk of Brown's car, agents found $50,000 in cash. They also found documents revealing Fred Tokars was more than Brown's defense attorney. He had incorporated an Atlanta nightclub for the drug dealer.
It was believed by law enforcement that the nightclub was a front to help launder the drug proceeds of the drug trafficking organization that Brown was a member of.
DEA agent Jeff Dahlman had participated in the sting operation to arrest Brown. Parker hoped Dahlman's drug trafficking case would help with the murder investigation.
What had happened as a result of the homicide of Mrs. Tokars was that the light got turned on Fred Tokars' past of what he had been doing for the past several years. And what was illuminated was that he'd been involved with several drug traffickers in the Atlanta area.
Investigators wondered how deep that involvement went. Police re-interviewed Tokar's neighbors to see if they had missed anything.
I was wondering if on Sunday evening...
One close friend confirmed that Sarah wanted to divorce her husband, but she was afraid of him. Not long before she was murdered, Sarah confided that she had found some of her husband's documents that seemed suspicious. According to the neighbor, Sarah said these weren't simply lists of offshore accounts. They were stronger proof of criminal activities.
Hey, listen, I need to give you a call back. Yeah, just a few minutes.
About a week and a half before Sarah Tokars' murder, Sarah Tokars exclaimed to her that she now had the goods on Fred, that she had found documents or records that indicated he had engaged in or was engaging in tax evasion, and that she was going to go to the authorities with this information and she could then get a divorce.
If Sarah had confronted her husband with the evidence, it might have motivated him to harm her. Investigators additionally found the name of a Tokars private investigator. The PI admitted to agents that Tokars had hired him to approach drug dealers about laundering their profits. He was listed as one of the owners, along with Fred Tokars, of another Atlanta nightclub, according to Special Agent Michael Twyble.
We determined that he was an owner of a company. But through our further investigation, we realized that he was a nominee. And when I say the word nominee, I mean the fact that he was delegated to the person being legally responsible as being an owner of the club. But in actuality, he was not.
Fred Tokars had constructed the entire scheme. According to the Private Eye, Tokars courted reputed drug dealers like Anthony Brown, men who had a lot of cash, but no place to invest it without raising suspicions of the IRS. Tokars, a money laundering expert, proposed depositing their drug profits in offshore accounts and in businesses like clubs that operated primarily on a cash basis. The money could then be filtered through legitimate financial institutions.
And the way you would launder the money is, even though it's still in cash, you would pay entertainers on paper $15,000, when in actuality you paid them $5,000 cash.
Tokars would receive thousands for each transaction.
He was actively involved, knowing that these people were drug traffickers and what they were doing with their money. The object was to open corporations, mainly nightclubs, cash businesses where they could easily hide their assets, where they could easily run their drug proceeds through them.
Authorities believe the connection between Fred Tokars and drug traffickers had somehow led to his wife's murder. But the details were elusive.
Get back in that car now!
Weeks after the murder of Sarah Tokars, a man capable of murdering an innocent mother in front of her children remained at large.
Got a shotgun blast in the back of the...
By December 1992, several weeks after Sarah Tokars was killed, federal and state authorities had still not found the lone gunman and still had no clues to his identity.
So it's a lot of...
Shortly before she was brutally murdered, Sarah believed she had discovered papers in her husband's law office that documented his illegal activities. Former U.S. prosecutor Buddy Parker believed that Sarah had likely threatened to expose Fred Tokars with those documents unless he agreed to a divorce.
That began to give us a feeling that Sarah Tokars was murdered to keep her mouth shut about her knowledge or her belief about her husband's role and involvement in laundering drug money for drug traffickers.
Fred Tokars not only represented violent drug dealers, he had gone into business with them. Investigators now had evidence Tokars' clients were laundering money through several nightclubs. If his wife had threatened to expose him, Tokars, as well as his clients, had a lot to lose. The FBI took a hard look at the nightclubs the attorney had incorporated. Special Agent Michael Twible had to wade through piles of state records, searching for a name that could link Tokars directly to the murder.
We started reviewing company and corporation records and liquor license and business license that Mr. Tokars had incorporated. We started looking at these different clubs to see actually who owned them.
Major drug suppliers like Al Brown contributed the funds. A middleman purchased the clubs. And Tokars set up the entire deal, as DEA agent Jeff Dahlman discovered.
They didn't really trust Mr. Tokars to launder money in offshore bank accounts. It was too elaborate. They wanted their money where they could touch it, where they could feel it, where they could use it every day, where they could buy cars with it. And so the laundering, in essence, in this investigation, turned towards the laundering of money through nightclubs, through incorporation of the nightclubs.
FBI agents interviewed employees of the nightclubs. Over time, they were able to piece together the structure of the business, its owners, and its profits. To Attorney Parker, it was like assembling a complex puzzle.
The picture of how the nightclub money laundering was structured was really developed through insiders through inside drug traffickers who ultimately decided to cut plea agreements with us and to cooperate and provide evidence.
But nothing from the nightclubs pointed to Sarah Tokar's killer. After months of frustration, Cobb County Police finally got a break. A detective working on the case got a tip from his brother, a deputy in nearby Fulton County. The deputy remembered seeing Fred Tokar's name in the file for a businessman who had an outstanding arrest warrant. The businessman's name was Eddie Lawrence, wanted for writing bad checks on one of Tokar's accounts. Of all Tokar's business associates and clients, Eddie Lawrence was a name he had never mentioned to police. Authorities quickly learned that Eddie Lawrence and Fred Tokar's were involved in several businesses together. These included construction, renovation, and mortgage companies. Tokar's had also defended Lawrence in several minor brushes with the law. It was a long shot, but it was the only lead they had left.
Eddie Lawrence had, through Fred Tokar's, been granted access to some of the most prominent individuals within the city. Fred would take Eddie to some of the big political fundraising functions, and all of a sudden Eddie was, like I said, he's very presentable. He could certainly mingle and not be embarrassed at cocktail functions and things, and engage in conversations, and so he was living this wonderful life, and the way he got there was through Fred Tokar's.
A few days later, the young businessman agreed to questioning after police discovered records of calls between he and Tokar's on the day of the murder. Eddie Lawrence said he had been in business with Fred Tokar's for almost a year. He claimed the phone calls were all job-related. He knew nothing about Sarah Tokar's murder. The detectives had Lawrence arrested on the bad check charge and then released him on bond. They wanted to see which one of Tokar's associates got nervous when they heard Lawrence was being investigated.
This is a shock to me when I heard about her death.
The plan worked. A confidential informant contacted police. The word on the street was that Eddie Lawrence had been looking for a hitman prior to Sarah Tokar's murder. He had pressured one of his employees to help him find someone to kill a woman who he claimed stood in the way of a lot of money. The employee gave Lawrence a name, Curtis Rower. Rower was a drug addict with a long rap sheet including armed robbery. He needed money. Maybe he'd be interested. Although the informant didn't mention Fred Tokar's by name, investigators finally had a potential link between the victim's husband, Eddie Lawrence, and a hitman. Detectives interviewed Eddie Lawrence.
No, I deny it.
They questioned him about his relationship with Tokar's.
That says recently you were trying to get him done.
Why would I have somebody?
He claimed no involvement in the murder.
When I had nobody hurt.
Police felt he was lying.
Making any progress here. I have a warrant. Your name.
On December 16, 1992, police detained Lawrence and revoked his bail because of the flight risk. They wanted him in custody when they went after Curtis Rower. Detectives immediately secured search and arrest warrants for a house in College Park where Rower was staying. They proceeded with caution. If Rower was capable of killing an innocent woman in cold blood, there was no telling what he might do when cornered. On December 22, 1992, 3 weeks after a mother of two was murdered, Cobb County Police circled a home in College Park to arrest suspected hitman Curtis Rower. The woman who answered the door said she wasn't sure if Rower was home. An initial sweep of the house produced nothing. Still, they kept up their guard. One officer thought he heard movement in a bedroom.
Curtis, you're in the bed. You see your hands.
It was Curtis Rower.
Hands where I can see them. Stay on the ground. Stay facing.
He was unarmed.
One out further. Lay down, all the way down. Spread your hands out. Keep them spread.
Rower was booked and charged with murder.
Give me your left hand.
He claimed that Eddie Lawrence, Fred Tokar's business partner, had offered him $5,000 to kill Sarah Tokars, but Rower was too scared to go through with it. He said Lawrence was the one who had caused Sarah's death. Rower admitted that he had carjacked the family. But when Sarah Tokars stopped, he said that he couldn't pull the trigger. At that moment, Eddie Lawrence ran up to the car, screaming for Rower to shoot. Lawrence grabbed the shotgun and it went off, killing Sarah Tokars. Both men then fled in Lawrence's car. Though police believed Rower was downplaying his role, Sarah's 6-year-old son was the only other witness they had to refute his claim. He remembered only one shooter. The boy would be forced to identify the man who terrorized his family from a lineup unless Eddie Lawrence corroborated Rower's story. Authorities charged Eddie Lawrence with conspiracy to commit murder, but Lawrence refused to confirm or deny Rower's statement.
Hello?
Cobb County Police notified Fred Tokars that Eddie Lawrence and Curtis Rower had been formally charged with his wife's murder. He received the news at Sarah's parents' house in Florida, where he was vacationing with his sons for the holidays.
Who was on the phone? It's the police. They've arrested someone for the murder. So, thank God for that.
His relatives later said that while the rest of the family expressed relief, Fred Tokars did not. He seemed despondent. The arrests of Lawrence and Rower had made national headlines. Tokars was caught in that same spotlight and refused to give any statements to the press. Because the suspected hitman's story conflicted with Tokar's son's version, the 6-year-old was asked to view a suspect lineup. Police explained that though he would be able to see 5 men staring at him, they would not be able to see him. The one-way mirror would prevent that. When the child said he was ready, investigators called for the men. All of them resembled the boy's description of his mother's killer.
Okay, Michael. One of these gentlemen may be the person.
Detectives reassured him that he could take as much time as he needed.
I want you to take your time. I want you to look at me closely. I want you to tell me.
But it was no use. The child was either too young or too frightened to remember the killer's face. When relatives tried to reach Fred Tokars in Florida to inform him, he was nowhere to be found.
Fred left the company of his in-laws and returned to his hotel room where no one heard from him. And the following morning, they tried to raise him on the telephone. They tried to find him, and there were no responses.
Concerned, Sarah's father rushed to the hotel where Tokars was staying.
Fred! Fred! Fred!
Fred Tokars had swallowed a handful of sleeping pills and washed it down with beer. The manager of the hotel quickly called an ambulance.
He had apparently attempted to take his life after hearing that Eddie Lawrence, this business partner of his, had been arrested for the murder of his wife.
Sarah's father found a note written in Fred Tokars' handwriting on the table beside the bed. In the locked hotel room, Fred Tokars wrote a long, rambling note apologizing for the pain and suffering his lifestyle had inflicted upon his family. He wrote that Sarah was a great woman. Then, on the day before Christmas Eve, Fred Tokars swallowed a handful of sleeping pills, enough to kill him. Fred Tokars lay on the bed, barely breathing. If he died, the truth about his wife's murder might die with him.
Come on, Fred.
Yes, there's been emergency.
In late December of 1992, Fred Tokars, the once prominent Atlanta attorney now suspected in his wife's murder, lay motionless in a Florida hotel room from an overdose of sleeping pills. He was rushed to a nearby hospital where they were able to revive him.
Thank you for coming down today.
After his release, he held a press conference.
A tough time for myself and also for my children.
He told the public that he was very depressed and that the media was not making it easy.
We did this terrible crime.
Tokars had gone to the extent of establishing residency in Florida to avoid the attention.
The whole way through this, so.
But he believed that justice would soon be served.
Mr. Tokars, may we have your comment on the arrest of Eddie Lawrence?
The FBI believed justice would soon be served as well. Convinced that Fred Tokars had used his business associate Eddie Lawrence to hire a hitman to kill Fred's wife, Sarah, the team of federal and local investigators would use federal racketeering statutes known as RICO to prosecute Tokars. Building a RICO case to prove Sarah Tokars had been killed to protect her husband's illegal activities meant outlining those activities in detail.
The RICO statute, it attacks basically this conspiracy of individuals who are out committing all types of different crimes, not necessarily together, but they're all for the benefit of this criminal group to exist, to continue to exist, and to make money.
Looks like things are coming together a little bit. I appreciate all you.
A federal grand jury named Tokars as an unindicted co-conspirator in the homicide.
Yeah, we've come up with some.
Though Tokars' partner, Eddie Lawrence, had remained silent after 7 months in prison, investigators hoped the public indictment might encourage Lawrence to testify against Tokars. Not long after, the Atlanta U.S. Attorney's Office received a phone call that Eddie Lawrence was ready to cooperate in exchange for sentencing consideration.
We've got some work to do. Let's go.
For Lawrence's long-awaited statement, investigators secured a remote location in Georgia that would be monitored by chopper surveillance. DEA agent Jeff Dahlman was part of the team that needed to make sure nothing went wrong.
We were there before Mr. Lawrence was brought in. His location had been kept a secret from everybody involved. The only people that knew of where Mr. Lawrence was actually being held at that time were the Cobb County Police Department. Mr. Lawrence at that time was a key witness in this investigation, and his safety was paramount to everyone.
Inside a fortified house, Eddie Lawrence told investigators that he and Tokars were not just partners in the construction business. They were also involved in laundering drug money.
$900,000.
couple of drinks.
Lawrence told FBI Special Agent Michael Twyble the details of the scheme.
Mr. Tokars wanted him to try to solicit drug clients in the various nightclubs and bring them to him so he could launder their money. And in turn also set up Eddie Lawrence into several businesses.
Yeah, we can get this one just a little bit later. We might
Lawrence owed his success to Tokars. He also owed the attorney $70,000 in business debts.
Fred Tokars approached Eddie Lawrence indicating that, that Sarah now was going to try to divorce him and take everything he had, and he wasn't going to let that happen, and he couldn't afford to allow her to do that to him, and he wanted her killed.
Lawrence refused initially. Although he had been involved in drug dealing, he had never been involved in murder.
Mr. Lawrence said, well, just let her have the house and the kids and the cars. And Mr. Tokar said, I'd worked so hard, I'm not going to let her have it.
Lawrence said that Tokars planned the murder for several months. His first idea was to have Sarah shot in his office, but decided the couple's home was a better location. Tokars was to pay Lawrence $25,000 for the hit.
Mr. Lawrence advised that Mr. Tokars wanted to be out of town and that for Mr. Lawrence to commit the murder as a burglary, basically in front of his children, which is very unusual. He told Mr. Lawrence that the kids would get over it, that they're young, and it wouldn't bother them saying that their mother was murdered.
I found that
Lawrence admitted he didn't have the nerve to kill an innocent woman, so he hired Curtis Rower. After Rower shot Sarah Tokars, Lawrence drove him away from the scene. Since he cooperated, Lawrence earned 12.5 years for his part in setting up the murder. The hitman he hired, Curtis Rower, was sentenced to life without parole. For the time being, Tokars was still a free man.
Mr. Tokars had custody of his 2 children. Our concern during this time and the rest of Mr. Tokars was that there could be some harm done to the children. And Mr. Tokars was aware that he'd been watched. The media was still down in Florida at the time. He knew that people were watching him daily, and we had to develop a plan to get Mr. Tokars out of the house where there'd be no harm done to the children or to himself, and tried to effect the arrest.
The agents knew Tokars hated the press. They posed as reporters, lurking around the condo, hoping to elicit a response from the wanted man.
And the game plan at that time was to have Mr. Tokars come out and check us out, which he had done previously to other people that had been parked in the area. The plan worked well. He came downstairs.
looking at us now.
He called the police.
Local officers arrived, aware of the ruse. Fred Tokars emerged from his condo to file a complaint.
What we need you to do, sir, is go ahead and what? Put your hand on your phone. You're under arrest.
Instead, he was arrested.
Spread your legs for me.
Fred Tokars pleaded not guilty to the charges against him.
Go ahead and put your hand on.
But separate state and federal juries found him guilty of racketeering, money laundering, murder for hire, and murder. He was sentenced to 4 life terms with no chance of parole. For elevating his greed beyond the life of his wife and children, he will never be free again. On the morning of March 3rd, 1993, in Silver Spring, Maryland, Vivian Rice stopped by her sister's house on her way to work. But this morning, something was wrong. Both garage doors were open, and her sister's minivan was missing. Inside the house, Vivian would discover a brutal triple homicide. executed by one of the most ruthless and cunning killers to ever challenge the FBI.
When 3 people were found murdered in their home, it appeared like a burglary gone awry. But a crime this horrific deserved a closer look. The suspect who had the most to gain from the deaths also had the perfect alibi. Photographic proof that he was 3,000 miles away when the crime was committed. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. It's our job to find the holes in even the most bulletproof alibi. In this case, we had our work cut out for us.
A Montgomery County, Maryland police officer responded to Vivian Rice's frantic 911 call. He found a female victim dead just inside the front door. He also found a second woman dead. And a young boy, apparently murdered in his bed.
We got 3 victims here. Need detectives and evidence technicians over here.
Through the day and into the night, investigators would scour the scene for evidence, thoroughly searching both inside and outside the house. They soon identified all the victims. Mildred Horn was a 43-year-old divorced mother employed as an American Airlines flight attendant. She had been shot 3 times in the head. Her 8-year-old quadriplegic son, Trevor, who required round-the-clock nursing care, appeared to have been suffocated. Police found him disconnected from his respirator. And Trevor's overnight nurse, 38-year-old Janice Saunders, had been shot twice, in the skull and in the eye. Evidence technicians began work immediately. They were thorough, but there was little evidence to collect. They dug a single distorted bullet fragment from the wood beside Trevor's window. Investigators took swabs of blood, carefully collecting samples for DNA testing. But the blood would match only the victim's DNA. With so little to lead investigators to a suspect, technicians scrounged harder for clues, collecting anything and everything that seemed promising. Outside the house, investigators found a metal file. Police were thorough, but the killer had been meticulous. Montgomery County, Maryland homicide detective Craig Wittenberger, named lead investigator, struggled to make sense of a case with 3 helpless victims, no obvious motive, and few clues.
There were some things that struck us as odd, I think, from the very beginning of the on-scene investigation inside the house. The foyer area, a closet, the contents had been dumped, everything been pulled out of the closet, dumped onto the floor. We found a purse, which we would later learn ultimately belonged to Millie. You had a lot of stereo entertainment equipment, TVs, a lot of jewelry, furs, that was untouched and left. Which again strikes you as odd. If this is a burglary or robbery gone bad, you're going to take something.
In fact, Mildred's minivan was missing from the garage, as her sister had noticed. But it was found quickly, not far from the house. Some of Mildred's credit cards were also missing, but found the next day on a nearby roadside by a jogger. Investigators now positively eliminated burglary as a motive. Instead, they wondered if the missing items were a deliberate attempt by the killer to throw them off his trail. The scene had the earmarks of a planned, professional execution. As for a suspect, at the crime scene, Vivian told them Mildred's ex-husband, Lawrence Horn, was probably responsible. She begged them to investigate him. He quickly became the prime suspect.
All the family members were giving us this information that kept pointing to Lawrence Horn that would be based on the very stormy, rocky relationship that Millie and Lawrence Horn had had for many, many years.
Danny, could you get this drum set up in number 5 for me, please?
All right.
Investigators learned that in the 1960s and 70s, Horn had been a top producer and recording engineer for Motown Records, credited with many hits, including Shotgun by Junior Walker and the All-Stars. He'd married Mildred, an airline attendant, in 1973. Then he'd moved with Motown from Detroit to Los Angeles.
Okay, give me the test.
But when the company's fortunes waned, so did his.
3.
He and Mildred divorced in 1987, but their problems continued. As Bob Dean, Maryland Assistant State's Attorney, soon discovered.
We did some research on Lawrence Horn in the courthouse that day, particularly what the status of his child support payments were and whatever civil aspects of his ongoing civil battle with his wife were. And he had just been held in contempt several months before for failure to pay $18,000 in child support.
But in reviewing more court records, investigators learned that on March 3rd, the day of the murders, Horn's financial outlook had brightened considerably. With his wife and son dead, he now stood to inherit $1.7 million. The money came from a malpractice settlement awarded to Trevor when a routine operation left him with brain damage. Should Trevor die, the settlement also listed his beneficiaries.
The beneficiaries of Trevor were obviously his mother and his father, and that was Millie and Lawrence. If Millie were dead, Lawrence got everything.
Hello, Miss Horn? Yes.
At Detective Wittenberger's request, the Los Angeles Police Department contacted Lawrence Horn within hours of the murders.
Lawrence, I think you better come out here.
Yes, Mother.
They tracked him to his mother's house.
Mr. Horn? I'm
Police
Officer
told
Nolan.
Horn about the murders and were surprised by his response.
Am I a suspect?
No, sir.
Mr. Horn's behavior was very odd. It was odd enough that the LAPD officers took note of it from the very outset. Not only did he not want to cooperate and want an attorney, basically his only questions or inquiries about were whether he was a suspect in this thing.
Police took him to the station for further questioning. They asked where he was at the time of the crime. He told them he was with his live-in girlfriend, Shira Bogan,
I was at home.
and described their activities. Later they would question her, and she'd corroborate his story.
I was at home.
If Horn or someone he employed had crossed state lines to commit the crime, they would have violated the Interstate Travel in Aid of Racketeering statute, a federal offense under FBI jurisdiction. Now, the FBI was brought in. A heinous crime had shocked the quiet community of Silver Spring, Maryland. A triple murder that brutally ended the lives of a quadriplegic boy, his mother, and his overnight nurse. With the prime suspect 3,000 miles away in Los Angeles, the prospect of an interstate investigation loomed. Local detectives called on the FBI.
Okay, all right, goodbye.
Special Agent Ed Roach was named case agent.
The case immediately became a coast-to-coast investigation because the principal suspect was living at that time in Los Angeles. So we involved the Los Angeles division of the FBI. Perhaps that we could assist later in the investigation, either through profiling at Quantico or with the assistance of the FBI laboratory.
Desperate for more clues, investigators sent a canine team back to where Mildred Horn's credit cards had been found by a jogger. The team soon recovered a rusty piece of metal, badly corroded, but clearly a gun part. Wittenberger sent it to the FBI lab for testing. FBI examiners determined the part was a trigger mechanism from an AR-7 rifle. A gun that's easy to disassemble into small pieces for transport or disposal, which seemed exactly what the killer had done. He had also taken another step to distance himself from the weapon. He'd very carefully drilled out the serial number. Often, a trained examiner can piece these numbers back together, but this killer had erased them for good. Another firearms expert would determine how long the gun part had lain by the side of the road. Analysis showed the amount of corrosion was consistent with the time elapsed since the killings had occurred. So this was likely the murder weapon. While the FBI lab processed the gun part, investigators in Maryland interviewed Tiffany Horn, Lawrence and Mildred's 18-year-old daughter.
Right straight ahead.
She was a student at Howard University in Washington, D.C. They gave her a routine polygraph test, which she easily passed.
Did you commit those murders?
No.
Later that day, Tiffany would talk with Detective Wittenberger, revealing 3 key clues. The first was something that had happened in the summer of 1992. Her father had called, asking her to videotape the outside of her mother's house for him, along with Trevor's room. The idea was so bizarre, she'd only taped Trevor and his nurse, with Trevor in his bed, attached to his respirator. Tiffany gave the tape to her father. Now Wittenberger and the FBI wondered if Horn wanted someone to know the layout of the house. Then, on March 1st, 2 days before the murders, Horn had called her again. He wanted to know where his younger daughter, Tamiel, would be for the next few days. Tiffany said Tamiel would be with Aunt Vivian the night of March 2nd, because her mother was flying out on an early flight the morning of March 3rd. It made investigators suspect that Horn had known when the murders would occur. Tiffany shared one other revealing incident that day. At about 2:30, the morning of the murders, she had inadvertently called her mother. Tiffany had hit the wrong speed dial key on her phone. She'd meant to call her boyfriend. She apologized and hung up. The timing of the call helped investigators estimate the timing of the murders, along with another observation. Trevor's round-the-clock nurses made entries every hour in a logbook near his bed.
Based on that, the 2:30 phone call, the 2 o'clock entry in the nurse's log, and there not being a 3 o'clock entry, and the autopsy findings, I think we pretty much based the time of death as being around between 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning.
On March 11th, about a week after the murders, Wittenberger and his partner flew to L.A.
Police officer, search warrant!
With the assistance of the Los Angeles Police Department, they carried a probable cause affidavit to search Horn's apartment. They collected hundreds of audio and videotapes. Police also gathered computers, personal papers, address books, bank statements, and telephone logs. Back at the station, investigators began the time-consuming task of reviewing all they'd recovered. They'd printed thousands of pages from the hard drives of Horn's computers. They found he'd made handwritten notes on documents regarding Trevor's settlement money. The notes confirmed what they already suspected. Horn was well aware he could gain a fortune from his son's death, and he was well versed in the legalities of the settlement. Investigators also found a map that was telling. It was hand-drawn, showing Mildred Horn's neighborhood. The streets were outlined and labeled. An X and her initials marked her house. Had Horn been directing a stranger to find her? Perhaps a contract killer. In the hundreds of hours of videotape that were recovered and screened, one home movie stood out. Horn had videotaped himself standing in front of his television set, which was tuned to the cable TV program guide station. The station was clearly broadcasting the time and date. 11:45 p.m., March 2nd, 1993, California time. 2:45 a.m., March 3rd, Maryland time. Exactly the time and date of the murders. Investigators quickly dubbed it the alibi tape, since it seemed to have been created for that purpose. Now, Wittenberger and the FBI seemed to have some substantial leads, but they were still far from apprehending the mastermind of this brutal crime.
There he is again. Same shit. He's walking back.
When investigators searched the LA apartment of their prime suspect in a triple murder, they discovered a suspicious videotape. Among themselves, they called it the alibi tape. But they would soon find a recording that was even more incriminating. A 22-second excerpt from Horn's dozens of audio tapes. It was from a conversation between Horn and an unknown male. The words were cryptic, but their meaning was clear.
Can you play that?
I gave a talk? No. Okay. All right, so I'm sitting there. Can you, take a picture? I can take a picture of him, right basically there, but I couldn't, the noise, you understand what I'm saying? I wasn't able to do that. I didn't want to go frontwise.
After listening to that, we felt Mr. Horn probably was in Los Angeles at the time. We also felt after listening to that conversation that this was probably the individual that committed these homicides making that phone call.
With the help of the FBI, investigators subpoenaed telephone records from AT&T for all the calls placed to Lawrence Horn's residence from a week before the murders to a week after. Most were useless, but 4 long-distance calls stood out. 2 had been made just days before the murders from a Detroit payphone. The other 2 were made in the early hours of March 3rd from payphones near Mildred Horn's house. One from outside a Denny's restaurant, and the other from a Days Inn. The call from the Denny's was made to the home of Lawrence Horn at 5:12 a.m. Maryland time, just a few hours after the murders.
What is going on? What time is it?
was it the cryptic 22-second conversation?
Yeah.
And who had made the call? Investigators spent hours scanning dozens of registration forms from local motels.
A check of the hotels and the motels in the area, a few miles circumference of the murder scene, turned up an individual checking in approximately midnight the day these murders were committed to the day's end, using a Michigan driver's license in the name of James Edward Perry.
James Edward Perry seemed a promising suspect. With Lawrence Horn's roots in Detroit's music industry and the Detroit call in his telephone records, perhaps there was a connection. Background checks revealed he'd served about 10 years' time for shooting a Michigan state trooper after an attempted bank robbery in the early 1970s. Now he was a minister.
He claimed he would be able to pick lottery numbers for people. People could call him for his advice. He had business cards and flyers that he would hand out, that he was, like I say, a minister. I believe he called himself on some of these things Apostle James.
As investigators learned more about Perry, Wittenberger had picked up another trail. In Lawrence Horn's telephone records, he'd noticed some calls had been made on a calling card.
What do you want?
He subpoenaed the records. The name on the card was Camilla McKinney. FBI agents appeared at Camilla's address. Instead, they found Marcia Webb. It turned out she was Lawrence Horn's cousin.
Oh, no.
She said Horn had asked her to get the card, claiming he needed it for business. She'd made up the name McKinney. She thought her past payment problems might keep her from getting a card. The calling card records revealed a complex web of phone calls. They began almost a year before the murders and continued for several months after.
We examined the records for that calling card account and saw that there were numerous calls throughout 1992 and 1993 from payphones in Los Angeles. Payphones that we plotted out on a street grid, primarily within walking distance of Lawrence Horn's house. It went directly to James Perry's house in Detroit.
I could do it.
And likewise, there were numerous calls from 1992 to 1993 of payphones throughout Detroit, primarily on the east side of Detroit, which is where James Perry lived, to Lawrence Horn's house in Hollywood.
And we figured Perry was looking for the rest of his payment. And we surmised that, that Horn was waiting for his windfall from his son's estate.
But if it seemed investigators had finally hit the jackpot, the prize remained just out of their grasp. Connecting suspects to calls required painstaking detective work, logging the time and phone number where each call was made and received, then attempting to place the suspects accordingly. Horn and Perry had covered their tracks with many layers of deception. Investigators were beginning to bog down, and their frustration was starting to show.
It starts out at an extremely fast pace. Everything's hot and heavy, very high-profile murder case. Everything, like I say, is rocking and rolling very quickly. Then all of a sudden the skids are put on. The investigation starts to slow down because now we've almost shifted gears and now going into a documentation that turns into almost a paper trail case.
But Wittenberger and the FBI stayed on the trail like bloodhounds. And in late September of 1993, they closed in on James Perry. They began a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week surveillance.
We We had the Michigan State Police and the FBI. Both agencies agreed to put him under surveillance in a cooperative effort. It was during a week in September that we saw that James Perry hung out with a particular individual. We didn't know who he was until we checked the tag of his car. It was a guy named Thomas Turner.
A background check showed the 52-year-old Turner was a trucker by trade. More significantly, he was another of Lawrence Horn's cousins. He was also fast friends with Perry. The two had met in prison 13 years before, when Perry was serving time for the state trooper shooting incident and Turner for robbing a bank. Identifying Turner would prove an important break in the case. But for now, investigators were hoping for something more immediate. Wittenberger and an agent did what investigators call tickling the wires. They paid Perry a visit, thinking Perry would then contact Horn and start talking. The investigators only talked briefly with Perry, but he admitted he was in Maryland on March 3rd, though he claimed it was for business and that he knew nothing about the murders. In September of '93, after weeks of wrangling for court authorization to tap Lawrence Horn's home phone, federal agents finally got the go-ahead. Special Agent Roach was key in obtaining the approval.
We were hoping to get the smoking gun, the conversation between James Edward Perry and Lawrence Horn. We were hoping for a conversation that would say something like, I want the rest of my money, you know, I did the deed, the down payment's not enough, you promised me such and such, I only got this, and now I want the rest of my money, or maybe you're going to be next. Something like that would have been terrific.
But Horn and Perry were too sly to let anything slip. And by mid-November, with the investigation at full tilt, they stopped talking to each other altogether. Despite months of slow but steady progress, Horn and Perry were still one step ahead of the law. The FBI's coast-to-coast investigation of a triple murder committed in Maryland left agents scrambling to link LA's Lawrence Horn and Detroit's James Perry to their case. Investigators knew the two men were talking, but they didn't know how. Were they using Perry's former jail buddy, Thomas Turner, as a go-between? The FBI secured authorization to tap Turner's phone.
Yep.
That was the key.
Yeah, what's up?
Both Horn and Perry talked
yeah.
to Turner often,
Yeah, okay,
and
that's
Turner
no problem.
relayed messages between them. But they were careful not to use language that might incriminate them. And once again, agents found themselves back in the same old grind, monitoring and logging hundreds of calls, then trying to make links between the callers.
All right, I'll talk to you later.
One surveillance would be taking place, actively taking place, physical surveillance in Los Angeles on Lawrence Horn, while at the same time, 24 hours a day, the Detroit division was conducting physical and electronic surveillance on Thomas Turner and physical surveillance on James Edward Perry.
As before, they made a few connections between calls and callers. But mostly, the process seemed just a test of their endurance and dedication. Horn and Perry were giving them a run for their money. Then, around Thanksgiving, after 3 grueling months, investigators got a bite. Perry was preparing to move. Agents secured a federal warrant to search his residence before he left. It was a dangerous mission. Perry had shot a Michigan police officer, and he was known to own high-powered weapons. An FBI SWAT team made the entry. Wittenberger and his partner followed. They roused Perry and his girlfriend from bed, catching them unaware and unarmed. Then they began to search the house. Police collected videotapes, bank statements, and other documents. Much of what they found seemed strangely out of place in the home of a so-called minister. There were voodoo relics, Soldier of Fortune magazines, and books on topics like criminal investigations, managing gunshot wounds, and interpreting bloodstain evidence. Investigators hoped to prove that Perry had bought the books as well. They called the publishers, getting only one hit from Paladin Press. A canceled check proved to be the turning point in the case. Perry had ordered 2 books from Paladin Press about a year before the murders, 2 chilling titles: Hitman, a manual for independent contractors, and How to Build Disposable Silencers.
When you read through those books, it was very disturbing to see the number of similarities and parallels from the Hitman book to what transpired inside Millie's home on March 3rd.
Finally, the pieces began to form a single picture. Mildred's missing minivan was explained. Perry had used it to get back to his rental car, which he'd parked some distance from the crime scene, as the book recommended. The credit cards found by a jogger on a road near the house also fit in neatly.
It said, if you want to make it look like a burglary, do a little bit of messing around the house, take some items and then throw them along the side of the road. It said, throw the pieces of the rifle along the side of the road. Another thing that the book recommended was to take a little narrow file and run it through the barrel of the rifle. And a little narrow file was found in the backyard with deposits of chemicals consistent with gunshot residue.
The book also suggested using an AR-7 rifle, exactly the gun whose trigger mechanism was found earlier. Likewise, examiners determined the single spent bullet found in Trevor's room was .22 caliber, popular with assassins. .22s distort when they enter a human body, so it's hard to match them to a gun. They're also small, quiet, and inexpensive. In January of 1994, there was another big break in the case. After months of pressure from Wittenberger, a grand jury subpoena finally brought in Thomas Turner. He agreed to talk in exchange for immunity.
1992. Could have.
In a deposition for a Maryland grand jury, Turner said his cousin, Lawrence Horn, had come for a visit in May of 1992, 5 months before the murders. Though Turner hadn't seen him in 20 years, Horn immediately complained of trouble with his ex-wife Mildred. Turner gave him the name of James Perry.
Yes, I'm sure.
That's all Turner would say, though Wittenberger believed he knew much more. Fortunately, he'd said enough.
At that point, because of what we had learned from Thomas Turner and what we had learned from the Hitman book and the wiretaps, we felt we were in a position to establish a conspiracy, to establish that James Perry had in fact carried out the killings.
That summer, Wittenberger struck. On July 19, 1994, he arrested Horn at his Los Angeles apartment without incident. Wittenberger would question him for 45 minutes at the police station, but Horn refused to talk about the crime. On the same day, FBI agents in Detroit were waiting for a judge to sign the warrants for the arrest of Perry. In the meantime, they conducted an overt surveillance. The tactic is designed to pressure a suspect while making sure he doesn't flee.
It wasn't supposed to be a covert surveillance, so we really didn't care if he saw them or not. We just didn't want it to be a confrontational surveillance until the warrants were signed.
Once the warrants were finalized, agents could arrest Perry. Until then, they would follow him in the open, knowing he knew they were there. They would keep him in sight at all times. Perry grew increasingly annoyed. The FBI didn't let up. It seemed Perry wondered what the FBI was trying to do, though he seemed more irritated than concerned. He drove off, still in clear view of agents. They didn't know where he was headed, but stayed with him anyway.
Watching.
He stopped to pick up a friend. A man the agents were not familiar with.
Stranger to me.
The two drove off in Perry's car, with the tail close behind.
Well, let's give him something to play with. Stay right on.
Then, incredulous, agents guessed where Perry was going. After only about an hour, the constant tail had made Perry so angry, he decided to file a complaint. Amazingly, he took his gripe straight to the Detroit FBI field office. Perry's timing was incredible. He and his friend arrived at the office just as FBI agents awaited final word on his arrest warrant.
I want to see an FBI agent now. This is a bad idea, Perry. Now! It's not bad. I want to see an FBI agent right now.
Perry demanded to see an agent.
I'm not going to calm down.
And he was quickly accommodated. A clerk called Special Agent Roach.
Bring heat on yourself.
Bring him on in.
Come on, you're home now.
Sir, would you step aside, please?
While agents checked him for weapons, Perry confronted Roach, wanting to know if agents were going to arrest him or if they were just planning to harass him.
First of all, I appreciate
And we told him in minutes, you were going to expect a phone call from Montgomery County, Maryland, telling us the warrants have been signed and you've been indicted for 3 counts of first-degree murder.
What you doing, man?
And the telephone came in a few minutes later, and we advised him that he was in fact under arrest.
You have the right to remain silent.
But now, even with both men in custody, one question still remained. If Perry was the hired gun, how had Horn paid him for the crime? After months of relentless pursuit by local investigators and the FBI, the elusive Horn and Perry were finally in custody. But there remained a nagging question. How had Horn paid Perry for the crime? The answer came 2 months later, only as a result of still more dogged detective work.
As we were reviewing the results of the search on James Perry's house, we noticed this photograph that in essence showed various cassette tapes that James Perry had. That was the purpose of the photograph, but underneath one of the items here, we saw a Western Union card. We got a bundle of records from Western Union showing us that there were indeed a number of transactions from Los Angeles to James Perry's live-in girlfriend, Pauline McGee. The person sending it was George Bernard Shaw. Well, we now had another area to investigate for a few months.
After much digging, Dean discovered a man named George Bernard Shaw had died in July of 1992 in an auto accident in Los Angeles.
When Dean sleuthed out the LA Times for the day of Shaw's death, he discovered the man's connection, though it wasn't in his obituary.
We have on the front page, Mary Wells dies. And for those in our generation, she was a big Motown star. Go to the obituary page, big story about Mary Wells dying in Los Angeles. In the lower right-hand corner was a list of other people who had passed away. One is a guy named George Bernard Shaw, with no information about him, just the cemetery.
Lawrence Horn had used the name of this anonymous dead man as the front for his payments, which were made with the money Horn was able to save. Almost 2 years after the crime, investigators had finally pieced together the whole story. It had been a cold and calculated murder for hire that took more than a year to plan. James Perry had followed the instructions in the Hitman book almost to a T. Perry had bought an AR-7 rifle and drilled out the serial number as the book suggested. And he'd built a disposable silencer using the book's directions. He'd carefully cut the parts and assembled it. He also packed a bag of supplies, a brown mechanic suit so he could walk through Mildred's neighborhood looking like a repairman, and latex gloves so he'd leave no fingerprints. In the months before the crime, he and Horn had talked often, discussing each detail. At Perry's request, Horn had sent him a map of Mildred's neighborhood and a video of Trevor's room. Horn had chosen a date when Tamiel would be out of the house, his only show of mercy in this heinous crime. On the appointed day, Perry had driven a car rented by Turner from Detroit. He checked into a motel near Mildred's house in Maryland. Perry had paid cash, as the book recommended, hoping the motel wouldn't require an ID.
I have to see some ID.
Paying cash.
I need to see.
But it did.
It's policy.
Without his Xerox driver's license, police might never have cracked the case.
We couldn't believe that he did something that dumb, that put him in Silver Spring, Maryland, on the date and the time of the murders.
Then, he'd driven his rental car to a shopping center near Mildred's house and walked from there, following Horn's hand-drawn map. In the house, unsuspecting, Nurse Janice Saunders made the 2 a.m. entry on a medical log attached to Trevor's bed. Perry approached the French doors at the back of the house, as planned. Though locked, the doors were easily opened. He entered, barely making a sound. Inside, he assembled his rifle and homemade silencer. He likely took Saunders completely by surprise. But when the boy stopped breathing, his medical alarm spoke for him. Upstairs, his mother awoke. Mildred Horn went downstairs to investigate. There, she too met the killer. Harry shot Mildred 3 times in the face. Then Harry roughed up the house a little to make it look like a robbery gone bad. As the book instructed, he took Mildred's credit cards. But it seems the persistent beeping of the medical alarm unnerved even this calculating killer. He stuck to the manual instructions. On his way out, he quickly bored out the gun barrel, using the metal file to foil ballistics tests as the book instructed. For a quick escape, he took Mildred's minivan back to where his rental car was parked. On the way, he'd scattered Mildred's credit cards and the gun parts, though only the trigger mechanism was found.
All right, so I'm sitting there.
Can you,
Take a picture. I can take a picture of him, right face there, but I couldn't. The noise, you understand what I'm saying? I wasn't able to do that. I didn't want to go front wise.
It was a case that had to be put together by really an exhaustive search of every clue possible, every clue imaginable. And we literally spent 1.5 years, 2 years doing nothing but working on this case.
In September of 1995, 2.5 years after the murders, James Perry was brought to trial in Maryland. Bob Dean served as special prosecutor because of his intimate knowledge of the case. Perry received life for conspiracy and 3 death sentences for the murders. Those death sentences were later commuted to life. Perry has no chance for parole. He is never admitted to committing the crime. Lawrence Horn's trial began that April in a packed Maryland courtroom. He faced the same charges as Perry, so much of the same evidence was used. Bob Dean again served as special prosecutor. After a 5-week trial, the jury found Horn guilty on all counts. He showed no emotion, and like Perry, he never confessed to the crime. On May 13th, Horn received 3 life sentences without parole. He appealed once and was denied.
I think both Mr. Horn and Mr. Perry did a very good job in planning this, and they came very close to getting away with this.
There would be one more bittersweet victory for the families of the victims. Following the murders, they filed a federal lawsuit against the publishers of Hitman, a technical manual for independent contractors. In late May of 1999, they won the suit, including a multi-million-dollar settlement and a promise from the publisher to stop selling the book.